Hi, folks. You're with Taskless today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. Now, in this chat, I'd like to talk about some of the great legal incidents in history where there's been ongoing and substantial travesties of justice, where due legal process and the rule of law are just being thrown out the window. And to some extent, this chat's going to be a follow-on from the previous one that I put up here. But let's go through some of those big events of history, those legal travesties, because I believe we're seeing one unfold before our very eyes today, all across the Western world, or wherever the globalist project is being forced on an unwilling populace. That's really the key. The globalists have a project, and it's to that they're no longer prepared to share power with the white voting public. They're no longer prepared to support the structures that the white societies of the world have developed over centuries and have come to rely on and expect and believe in. That's all got to go in order to enforce the globalist project on an unwilling populace. And part of this is that they've got to destroy the rule of law and the rules of evidence and independent courts. All that's got to be set aside and destroyed in order for the globalist project to go ahead. Now, what we're seeing, I believe, is a repeat of the great mistakes of history, the huge errors of history for which societies have taken many generations to recover from, and in some cases, even today, the consequences of these crazy travesties of justice. They're still living with the people today, even though it may have happened, generations ago. Such are the consequences of these mistakes. So these errors. Now, it's not errors as in just an oversight or, gee, I didn't think this would happen. It's not a mistake in that sense. It's a group of people who are following an ideological course, and they're determined to push through and accept any collateral damage in pursuit of their ideological objectives. And this is what causes the problem in the end. They assume that any collateral damage is acceptable, and the more the casualties mount up, the more they believe they're just one more killing away from achieving their objective, an objective, of course, that never finally comes about anyway. So, or in pursuing the objective or reaching it, they've had to destroy so much that there's nothing left to build on. So let's look at some of those great travesties of justice in history, and I'll pick a few, and I'll move quickly here because there's a lot of details I could go through, so I have to move fairly swiftly on this. But the first one is the Spanish Inquisition. Now, just to set the sort of scene here. The Catholic Church has been probably the primary binding agent in certainly Central and Western Europe for quite some time, since more or less the fall of the Roman Empire. Most of what was the Roman Empire fell apart into small principalities and little dukedoms and fiefdoms and so on. Nation states, of course, came later, but in that interim period, it was pretty much the Catholic Church that kept things going. And illiteracy was very high, but the Catholic clergy, at least for the most part, were very literate, and they were the historians and and people that were recording the events of the day and of course holding services and so on. But things started to fall apart. The Catholic Church became a big player in the political situation in Europe at the time, and there were a few sort of forces that were coming in on them at once. On one hand, there was the Islamic Ottoman Empire that was expanding from the east, and they'd taken over. They'd actually absorbed most of the Balkans. That even got as far as the gates of Vienna in Austria. That's how far they penetrated into Europe, the Islamic Turkish Ottoman Empire, and they had Greece, most of the Eastern Mediterranean, and so on, and of course around the Middle East as well, and what we call Saudi Arabia, all those places. They'd fallen under Ottoman control after a while, so that they were quite a large empire, and they were coming in from the east. And then the Catholics needed to raise money to fund armies, because a lot of the Western states were really too small to field decent-sized armies, and they couldn't afford it either. So the Catholic Church was trying to raise the money to do it. They went through a lot of things like giving people dispensations for all their sins and passports to heaven and things like that. And these were expedients, and they were hardly Christian and charitable, but nonetheless they were doing those things. And at the same time as all that was going on, then the Protestant religion was starting to show up, and we're talking about Martin Luther and his putting his principles on the nailing them to the cathedral door and so on. And so there were a number of threats and pressures coming in on the Catholic Church at the time. Now in Spain, where the Spanish Inquisition sort of kicked off, the Spanish had really just reconquered Spain from the Moorish Islamic hordes in the late 1400s, and so there were still a lot of followers of Islam there, and they wanted to be given the church wanted them to be given the opportunity to convert to Catholicism and Christianity, or they were to be expelled, or they were to suffer the consequences, as we would use in the modern day parlance. So those were the times, and those were the pressures. Now the courts in those days, there were courts in sort of feudal type courts, but the main courts were what we would call canon law courts, canon law, which means religious law in effect. So they were meant to be religious principles. Did you defile God's laws and those sorts of things, Ten Commandments and the like. So and there was a more complex system than that, but it was very religious ideological. And the Catholic Church decided, particularly the Spanish sort of division of it, decided that the Church and Christianity was under threat from all sides. And in the midst of this paranoia, some of it justified, but paranoia nonetheless, they wanted to impose a certain way of life on everybody in Spain, and they were determined to root out all those who may oppose it or not agree with it, or be a little lackluster in support of it. So this is where the Inquisition courts, I'm simplifying this a bit here, but this is where the courts of the Inquisition came in. Now, in order to go about their business quickly and to get the job done and to push through these changes and to re-engineer society, they thought, well, screw the law. What we'll do is we'll have, if anyone accuses anyone of it could be witchcraft, or not attending church on a Sunday, or not being sufficiently ardent in their devotion to Christianity and so on. If there's any informant that comes forward, or even informants were being invented, then that person is guilty and has to prove they didn't do it. Now, that's a very hard thing to prove. So again, we see this, as we see throughout history. We see where the asserting a crime or alleging a crime, or an informant is supposed to have alleged that there's a crime that's taken place. Then the crime doesn't have to be clear. It can be vague, and that can be ideological. The allegation doesn't have to be clear and concise. That can be vague. And then someone's dragged in front of this Inquisition, or court of the Inquisition, and it will prove you're innocent. Without knowing exactly what the charges were, or even what the alleged crime may have been. And if they couldn't prove it to the satisfaction of the inquisitors, then they could be tortured to the point where they were maimed, crippled for life, in order to extract from them the truth. So there was, as you can imagine, this was a huge opportunity for the malicious, the vicious, and the hateful to act out their twisted vengeances and so on, and many did. So the courts of the Inquisition became notorious for arbitrary arrest, arbitrary detention, arbitrary torture. Now, if the reverse had been the case, and if someone had come along and said, well, I think those folks down the road did this or did that, then okay, what is your evidence? Well, I kind of don't have any. I just thought maybe, I think the guy's a bit of an asshole. So I thought, no, well, that's not good enough. So stop wasting my time and get the fuck out of here. Then a lot of these things wouldn't have happened. So they had to accept a very, very low burden of proof, just a vague allegation that was unproven, untested, and then that was enough to initiate legal proceedings, arrest and detention and the torture and so on that I mentioned a moment ago. So, but if the burden of proof had been high enough to require facts and corroborated facts, those sorts of things, before there was an arrest, and that confessions under torture were inadmissible and those sorts of things, then it would have been very difficult for the Inquisition to have gone about its business and spread so much arbitrary mayhem. And that's, of course, what they didn't want. They wanted to be able to terrorize people, to strike fear in the hearts of everybody, so that they would get a higher rate of conformity and there would be no resistance or disagreement. Now, just as we have today, the rich people were able to bypass that system, and they would just pay a fine that the poorer people couldn't afford. They'd just pay a fine and they would be burned in effigy. So they'd make a little straw sort of thing with a few clothes around it, and then they would burn these people in effigy and collect the fine, and job done, and they'd move on to the next town. But the unfortunate poor people, if they were found guilty, and there was a sort of grading of alleged crimes, if they are found guilty, then they could very, very likely be burned at the stake. Now, burned at the stake seems cruel and horrible, which it is, by the way, but the view at the time was that that if they had committed these crimes, that they were possessed or had been in league with demons, so that their burning at the stake would exorcise the demons, which would allow the soul to ascend unto heaven. So, and we still see even the last vestiges of those sorts of attitudes in Islam today, for example. Stoning a woman to death, for example, exorcises the demons from her body and things like that. So it's very medieval and ancient in attitude. So that was the Spanish Inquisition. Now, even today, the Spanish Inquisition is the main inquisitors, Torquemada's and so on. Their names are known today, 500-600 years after the event. Such is the extent that is held up as an example of how not to run a legal and judicial court system. So that's the infamy that it achieved, and even going back, as I say, that far. So there are more modern examples, of course, and I'll use the Nazi people's courts as one. Now, particularly where they targeted Jews, but really anyone they didn't like, but particularly targeting the Jews, they would use various devices. Again, it was the same copybook, that somebody makes an allegation. Now, all it required was that a Jewish person is alleged to have looked menacingly at a Gentile. That was enough, and the allegation and the accusation didn't even have to be corroborated or proven in court, and that would be enough for the Jewish person to be arrested or summoned to court. And then there were various devices that were used, which were very Kafkaesque, such as sending the Jewish accused person to a court 20 miles away, and then changing the venue of the court at the last minute. So the Jewish person was 20 miles away at another building, and then they would hold a hearing in absentia, because the Jewish litigant had gone off 20 miles, as they were told the court hearing would be, and then they were declared guilty, and there was no real process of appeal or nothing that was easily achievable, and there could be they could have a large fine or a fine so big that they could have their business confiscated from them and so on. But it was deliberately set up to give the state a very low burden of proof to go after them, but to give the Jews to rebut it had to meet a very high burden of proof. And all sorts of tricks were used. The Jewish person was meant to have been in a certain village at a certain time. They clearly weren't. They had witnesses to prove it, but the court wouldn't allow those witnesses to give testimony. Therefore, the Jewish person was made guilty, and so on. So it was deliberately there to frustrate and attack and demonize and all sorts of things the Jewish people. And so these things were done at administrative level, Department of Prosecutions level, judicial level, and at the police level. And of course, we're seeing that today in the Western world. We're seeing that same thing happening. One of my other bugbears that really gets me is the amount of, certainly in North America, the amount of Jews, activist Jews, that seem to support and even promote this idea of arbitrary law, as long as it's getting the Gentiles or that sort of thing. Have the Jews learned nothing in history? Nothing. They've been persecuted for centuries for various things. I mean, justified or not, it really doesn't matter. But this idea they've been attacked using a very minimal burden of proof method of attacking them and then forcing them to meet an extremely high burden of proof. And yet many of them are supporting it today in the West. Goodness me, they should be the biggest supporters of independent rule of law, due legal process, all that sort of, rules of evidence. They should be the biggest supporters, the one absolutely in the front line arguing for it. And yet most of them, as far as I can tell, and certainly in my view, are on the other side arguing for more arbitrary law and so on, as long as they're not the ones that are being dragged into courts or the subject to these what would you call them, witch hunts and so on. So that's the Nazi one. Also, the Nazis engaged in just pure humiliation of the Jews in court. And again, we're seeing that now. Activist judges are castigating and humiliating. I've watched court cases where the judges will jeer and laugh at litigants they don't like, and even invite all the court staff to laugh along. So there's supposedly this independent court all jeering and laughing at a litigant because they voted for Donald Trump. I mean, give me a break. Seriously, have we descended? Have we gone down that far? Another one is say the case of Pol Pot in Cambodia, and again we see a very ideological situation. Pol Pot, who interestingly was quite a good student, educated in France, given at the time that Indochina area was a French colony. So Pol Pot wanted to impose communist Marxism on the Cambodian people, which is a place just near Vietnam, and went about it in the most brutal way. But he's determined to again, same copybook. Children were encouraged to make allegations against adults because children were supposed to be pure and uncorrupted. But children were encouraged to allege adults had done this or done that, and they just made it all up most of the time. But then the adults were then dragged into these courts, and again, same thing, very low burden of proof to kick things off. The person has to somehow prove they're innocent, even though they don't even know what the allegation is or the alleged crime is. But they, of course, can't prove it, so they're taken out the back and shot or beaten to death or just arbitrary or imprisoned and not fed, so they die of hunger and these sorts of things. So this, and then given I think the population of Cambodia was around 8 million. And some of the higher estimates suggested as many as 2 million people were murdered by Pol Pot and his goons during that time. Ironically, it was another communist country that liberated Cambodia, but anyway, that was we're looking at as much as 25% of the population, but they still wanted this veneer of legitimacy. They still wanted this pretense of a legitimate process, which of course it wasn't, but dragging people through these bullshit courts and children's courts, children pronouncing death sentences on adults and things like that. I mean, these can't be desirable in any society. So, but Pol Pot, as crazy as he was, believed that this would purify society of any elements that may not fully go along with his new ideological program. And let's just look at globalization today. It's an ideological program. It has no basis in sensible, reasoned, fact-based, organic approach to government or economics or anything. It is purely fucking ideological. And so we're seeing the same things here. They can't put the ideology in, or people are resisting it. Fine, then we'll just go and accuse them of something and drag them into some bullshit court, and then throw them in prison again. Look at the people that are sitting in prison now without any proper charge or no proper hearing, because they participated in a protest in Washington D.C. It's insane, but it's happening. And again, the lessons from history and so on. So there's the Pol Pot thing there. We can also look at the Soviet Union. Now, wherever you see a communist nation, then it's an ideological construct, and they believe that if there's even one person who doesn't go along with it, then the state is under threat, because that one person could then contaminate another person with their anti-communist ideas. So that's the sort of the ideological perception of things. So what the Soviets did, and by the way, all the Chinese communists, Eastern European, and so on, the East German Stasi, is that they gave themselves, the state had a very low burden of proof to me. They could just allege. So again, an informant says something, the evidence isn't tested, there's no corroboration, and so on. If it's a high-profile person, they may put tails on them, keep them under surveillance, hoping to nab others in the process. But generally, it was just someone alleged you did it. We don't have to tell you who. We don't have to tell you what they alleged. And next thing you know, you're dragged off the street. A very low burden of proof. Similarly, if you have to, or trying to prove your innocence, you must meet a very high. It has to be beyond conclusive that you didn't do what was alleged you had done. And again, given you don't know what your crime supposedly was, because they're using vague terms like an enemy of the people, or a counter-revolutionary, or having bourgeois thoughts, that sort of thing. So in reality, it's, well, what the fuck does that mean? How do you disprove that? No, I didn't have bourgeois thoughts. Oh yeah, you read a book in Shakespeare 20 years ago. So, well, what does that mean? Well, we say it means you had bourgeois thoughts. We then say bourgeois thoughts is criminal. So suck on that, motherfucker. And this was the sort of the standard of so-called criminal justice. But the whole idea was to enforce an ideology on the people and get them to accept it, and to get them to say, there is no way out of this. You've got nowhere else to go. It's this and that's it. If you don't like it, we will crush you, which is how the globalist thing is unfolding right now in front of our eyes, and why we should oppose it for that reason. If the globalist project is so good, they can convince us it's so good, and they can lay out the evidence, say, well, this is why it's a good idea, this is why it's going to work in your favor, and this is why we should do it, and this is why you should vote for it in free and fair elections. But they're not doing that. We don't give a shit whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not. If you don't like mass migration, if you don't like so and so, we will crush you, and we'll use the justice system to do it if we want to. So there's a few examples in history. I mean, there are others, and I could go through them, but I think that illustrates the point. And we need to be aware of this, and to understand that it leads us down a dark road that we should really think about before we head any further down it. I'll add something that I've spoken to a number of law students, recent graduates sometimes, or youngish lawyers, I guess, who have already started practicing, a lot of them going to, say, some of the bigger law firms. And I've asked them about how are any of these things covered in their studies, such as the Spanish Inquisition, or any example of where courts are corrupted and the legal process is corrupted by the state in order to get at citizens they just don't like. And none of them say that they've learned anything about it, or know anything about it, or even understand the concept of the separation of powers. The separation of powers is where the state and the judiciary are separate. The state has the power to appoint judges. They don't have the power to influence those judges, or to threaten them, or say you better do this or else, or other methods of intimidation against judicial officers. Now, clearly, radical activists are being appointed to courts all across the Western world, and it's all also clear that the judges that maybe aren't on board with the radical activist agenda are being threatened or intimidated somehow into making decisions that the state wants. But it's the separation of powers issue is where in England, after the English Civil War in the the 1600s, and I think it's like 1650, just off the top of my head. The Parliament, the British Parliament, and Oliver Cromwell and that sort of stuff decided to, or voted to, execute the king. Now, this was a pretty serious step. This was like 100 years, or more than 100 years, before the French Revolution, and the French king was executed at the guillotine. So this was a serious step to take. Now, Cromwell and his goons intimidated the Privy Councillors into voting for the king's execution without having a trial that examined the evidence, whether the king was guilty of what was alleged or not. They went through a bullshit sort of hearing with the king, but they didn't. It wasn't a proper court hearing with the rules of evidence and due legal process and a presumption of innocence and the king having representation, all that sort of thing. It wasn't done like that. Not that the king was helpful. He did refuse certain legal assistance there, but nonetheless, the idea of executing a king because you don't like him or he's now inconvenient, so from that came the separation of powers that stuck in the craw of so many of the politicians. They decided, no, this is not a good, we're going down a really bad path here. We'll not do this again. We need to separate the powers of the state and the judiciary, and the rules of evidence and the facts should apply in determination of guilt or innocence. So that's where the separation of powers came from. But we're losing that. We're losing that. The state now just casually almost, and we see it in the United States and elsewhere around the Western world, the state is actively telling judges outcomes that they want, and appointing activist judicial officers. Departments of prosecution are making sure that activist judges will hear cases that they'll be sympathetic to, and so on. So we're losing that separation of powers, and it needs to be reinstituted. So that's a run through of the issues. But those mistakes of history are made. We're doing it again. We're doing it again right now in the West and allowing it to happen. And feckless politicians are taking us down this path, and it's not a good place to be. And this is not a case of the road to hell paved with good intentions. These intentions are dark, they're evil, they're ideological, and they are failing to uphold the traditions of law that the West has developed, and is one of many reasons, but one of the reasons why the West is the freest, or has been the freest, wealthiest part of the globe. It's because of these things that are being taken away from us right now. That's my take on things. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.